I always figured we had the ideal marriage. After 5 years together, I still found it hard to believe I'd landed someone as amazing as her. But all that changed dramatically last Tuesday night, with just one sentence that hit me as hard as a speeding truck. "Intimacy is off limits until you start obeying me," she said, her voice disturbingly calm as she stood in the doorway of our bedroom. At first, I laughed it off, assuming she was pulling some weird joke or perhaps suggesting a new role-playing idea. But the serious expression in her eyes quickly told me this wasn't a laughing matter. It all began with something insignificant. I'd agreed to dinner plans with my college buddies without running it by her beforehand. To be fair, we've never needed approval slips for everyday social activities in the past. But evidently, this had crossed some invisible boundary I didn't even know existed. "You're acting like I committed some kind of crime," I said, hoping to ease the growing tension. "It's just dinner with the guys." She folded her arms and leaned against the door frame. "It's not about the dinner itself," she replied sternly. "It's about you respecting my opinion and including me in decisions that affect both of us." She'd expressed annoyance over my independence before, but this was the first time she deliberately weaponized our intimacy. At that moment, something inside me broke. Suddenly, I realized clearly how our relationship had transformed into a struggle for control. "So you're withholding affection to control me?" I asked softly, my voice barely louder than a whisper. She shrugged casually. "I'd rather call it setting healthy boundaries," she replied evenly. "When you start consulting me before making plans, we can go back to normal marital relations." The casual, almost indifferent way she issued this ultimatum sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, memories flooded back. I recalled those subtle signs of disappointment whenever I chose to spend time with my family instead of exclusively with her. Those passive-aggressive remarks she made whenever I pursued interests she didn't share. The way she gradually isolated me from friends she labeled as negative influences, essentially anyone who encouraged me to maintain my own identity. I ended up sleeping on the couch that night, not because she forced me to, but because I couldn't bear being close to someone who viewed love as some transactional arrangement. Lying awake, staring at the ceiling, memories washed over me. How she'd emotionally distance herself whenever I didn't immediately give in to her demands. How she'd impose silent treatments, forcing me to apologize for imaginary offenses. I began to realize, with an unsettling clarity, that this ultimatum wasn't new. This was just the first time she'd voiced it explicitly. She had, for years, subtly conditioned me to put her approval ahead of everything else, including my own happiness and needs. The following morning, I mechanically went through our usual routine: coffee, breakfast, a quick goodbye kiss. But my mind raced with questions. How had I missed this pattern? How much of myself had I already sacrificed? And most importantly, was this relationship even worth saving? I called my friend and canceled our dinner plans, not because I was surrendering to her demands, but because I needed some space to reflect. Her triumphant smirk when I told her I wasn't going out that night made me feel sick. She had mistaken my step back as defeat. "See, that wasn't so difficult, was it?" she said sweetly, gently brushing her hand across my shoulder. "When you take my feelings into account, everything works out better for both of us." I nodded absent-mindedly, already forming a plan. If she wanted to play mind games with our marriage, she was about to discover I wasn't the easy target she thought I was. You can only push someone so far before they stop retreating and start pushing back. She had no idea her ultimatum hadn't broken me. It had, in fact, reignited something I'd neglected for too long: my self-respect. The playing field she believed she controlled was about to be flipped in ways she couldn't anticipate. Over the next few days, I played along with her little game, closely observing her behavior from my newly opened eyes. It felt like finally getting a pair of glasses after years of squinting. Suddenly, patterns I'd completely missed before became painfully obvious. That evening during dinner, I casually mentioned a work project that might require some weekend hours. Her immediate response revealed a lot. "You can't seriously be thinking about that," she protested, placing her fork down slowly and deliberately. Weekends are our time together. That's always been our rule. The extra pay would boost our vacation savings. I countered carefully, watching her closely. She softened her tone, adopting the persuasive voice I now recognized clearly as manipulation. Money isn't everything. What's the point of a vacation if we're too distant emotionally to even enjoy it? Before my realization, I'd have quickly backed down, apologizing for even considering disrupting our usual routine. Instead, this time, I simply nodded, changed the topic, and quietly noted how she cleverly twisted my career opportunities into some betrayal of our marriage. That night, I scrolled through old texts and emails between us, seeking evidence of this disturbing pattern. What I found troubled me deeply, a deliberate, systematic campaign to isolate me from outside influences. Comments about my mother being overly involved in our affairs. Subtle, yet biting criticisms of friends who encouraged my independence. Convenient headaches whenever I planned activities outside her control. The next morning, I reached out to my oldest friend, a guy I hadn't spoken to in months because she'd labeled him disrespectful to our marriage. Man, I was starting to wonder if you'd vanished from the face of the earth, he said, genuine concern evident in his voice. Is everything okay? Honestly, I'm not sure, I confessed. Things at home have been complicated. She finally showed you who she really is, Ty? He asked knowingly, confirming my fear that others had noticed what I'd been too close to recognize myself. He reminded me of incidents I'd forgotten, like the drama she'd stirred up at his wedding, angry that the attention wasn't solely on her. Or the time she'd sabotaged a camping trip, feigning illness, only to magically recover once I canceled our plans. That evening, feeling empowered by this fresh perspective, I decided to test the waters. Rather than ask, I simply informed her I'd be meeting my friend for lunch the following day. Her response was explosive. So, this is your reaction to my concerns? You deliberately defy me. I'm not defying you, I responded calmly. I'm catching up with an old friend. It's what normal people do. Normal people discuss their plans with their spouse first, she shot back. Discuss or ask permission? I finally addressed the elephant in the room directly. Because those two things are completely different. Her eyes narrowed into a dangerous glare. If you walk out that door tomorrow, don't count on getting anything from me for a very long while. There it was again, the familiar threat, using intimacy as leverage to control me. Only this time, instead of anxiety, I felt strangely freed. She held power over me only because I'd always prioritized our physical connection above my own freedom. But what if I decided to shift that balance? I think I can handle that, I said calmly, surprising both of us with my newfound boldness. For just an instant, panic flickered across her face, the first genuine emotion she'd show me in days. She quickly masked it, though, her expression returning to a cold, determined stare. We'll see how long you hold out before crawling back, she scoffed, turning away dismissively. You always do. That night, alone in our guest bedroom, I scrolled through pictures from the early years of our relationship. Were the warning signs always there? Had I overlooked the red flags because of her attractiveness, charisma, and ability to make me feel special whenever I behaved in ways she approved of? The uncomfortable truth became clearer with each memory. Our entire marriage had always been built on a lopsided power structure that I'd unknowingly agreed to from the start. But now that I've finally seen it, there was no unseeing it. With this realization, a decision emerged within me: this unhealthy pattern would end, one way or another. Lunch with my friend the next day felt like surfacing after nearly drowning. For 2 full hours, I spoke openly without carefully choosing my words to avoid disapproval. No tiptoeing around sensitive topics, no strategic omissions, just genuine, easy conversation. You seem different, he observed, finishing his meal. Almost like your old self again. I'm finally remembering who that person is, I admitted. When I returned home, she was waiting, standing rigidly, barely controlling her anger. She obviously anticipated a confrontation, but instead, I just smiled and walked past her toward my home office. That's it, she snapped, following me. You're not even going to explain yourself? Turning to face her, I kept my voice steady and neutral. I had lunch with a friend. It was good. There's nothing else to talk about. Her mouth opened and closed, completely thrown off by my unwillingness to engage in the argument she expected. This scenario wasn't part of her usual playbook. She needed me either apologetic or defensive, both emotional reactions that proved her control over me. Over the following week, I began practicing something I privately called silent resistance. Instead of openly arguing or challenging her directly, I gradually reclaimed little bits of my independence without drama or explanation. I signed up for that photography class I'd always wanted to take. When she complained that it interfered with our usual TV night, I simply shrugged and told her, "You can record it." I started reconnecting with coworkers after hours. When she bombarded me with texts during these gatherings, I replied just once with, "Having a good time. We'll talk when I get home," then silenced my phone. I reopened my old personal bank account, not to hide money, but as a precaution, recognizing how uneasy it made her whenever I spent money without her prior approval. Each small step toward independence prompted escalating reactions from her tears, accusations, guilt trips, and, of course, her continued withholding of intimacy. But something surprising happened during that period. Day by day, her leverage weakened. By removing affection as a reward for compliance, she'd unintentionally freed me from its influence. Initially frustrated, I soon found myself gaining clarity. I understood now just how much of my previous behavior was driven by my desire for her approval, her affection, her validation. Without those incentives, I saw clearly just how high the price had been. 2 weeks into this quiet rebellion, she decided to switch tactics. Coming home one evening, I found her dressed provocatively, candles lighting the living room. Her entire demeanor transformed. "I've been reflecting," she began softly, her voice sweetened with artificial regret. "Maybe I've overreacted about certain things. We don't have to keep up this standoff." I instantly recognized her strategy, the carrot after the stick had failed. This was a temporary surrender, designed solely to regain control. If I accepted this offer, soon enough the restrictions and manipulations would return. "I appreciate the gesture," I said cautiously, "but I think we need to resolve the underlying issues first before jumping back into physical intimacy." Her seductive smile faltered. "What issues?" "I'm trying to move past this." "That's exactly the problem," I replied firmly. "To move past something, we first need to acknowledge it. We haven't talked about why you thought it was acceptable to use intimacy as leverage." For just an instant, her mask slipped, revealing a flash of cold calculation behind her eyes. Then she quickly recovered. "You're overanalyzing this." I was upset. I said something I didn't really mean. "Can't we just forget about it?" "No," I countered gently. "I think you meant exactly what you said, and it revealed how you truly see our relationship. That's precisely what we need to address." She abruptly stood, abandoning any pretense of reconciliation. "So now you're a relationship expert? Analyzing every word I say like some therapist?" "No," I said evenly. "Just someone who's finally paying attention." That night marked a turning point. As she slammed doors and loudly expressed her indignation, a new emotion quietly took hold within me, not anger, not resentment, but something far stronger. Indifference. Her approval. Her disappointment. Her tactical affection. All of these were rapidly losing their grip on me. I fell asleep that night fully accepting something that would have scared me to death just weeks earlier. If saving this marriage meant sacrificing who I was ready to let it go. The table she thought she controlled had begun to wobble, undermined by my calm, persistent refusal to play by her rules. The email came on a Wednesday morning, simple, yet life-altering. My company's West Coast office was looking for someone to lead a new creative department. It was a 6-month assignment, with a real possibility of becoming permanent. Not only did the position promise a considerable raise, but it offered something even more valuable. Distance. I stared at the computer screen, my heart beating faster. 3,000 miles separating me from her. A perfect, legitimate excuse to hit reset. Quickly, I forwarded the email to my personal account, wanting to review it privately before she noticed it on our shared home computer. That evening, at dinner, I casually brought up something intriguing that had come up at work, carefully observing her reaction. The company's expanding our creative department. I mentioned lightly between bites. There might be an opportunity to move up. She nodded approvingly. That sounds promising. A promotion would be great for us. Always us. Even when clearly, this was about me. It would mean extra responsibility, I continued vaguely. Maybe longer hours, at least at first. Her smile tightened slightly. Well, as long as it doesn't disrupt our home life too much. You know how withdrawn you get when you're stressed. Withdrawn. Interesting interpretation of my occasional need for solitude. I'll have to weigh if it's worth it, I replied non-committally. I waited until the weekend to fully reveal what the opportunity entailed, deliberately choosing a public restaurant, a place where she'd have no choice but to stay composed. So, about that job possibility, I started as our food arrived. It's actually located in San Francisco. Her four-kidder played sharply. San Francisco? As in California? Last I checked, that's still where it is. Yes. Her voice dropped, low but intense. You're seriously considering moving clear across the country? It's a 6-month assignment initially, I calmly explained. A trial period, essentially. And what about me? What about our lives here? Did you even think of me before getting excited? There it was, not a single question about what this meant for my career, my ambitions, my future. Only about how it disrupted her plans, her routine, her carefully controlled world. I actually thought it could be an adventure for both of us, I suggested. You're always saying you like to explore more of the country. For vacations, not to uproot my life, she snapped. My entire support system is here, my job, my friends, my entire routine. You can take a sabbatical, I offered gently. Or even find temporary work out there. Silicon Valley always needs experienced marketing professionals. Her eyes narrowed sharply. You've already planned all this out, haven't you? Making decisions that completely overturn our lives without even consulting me first. I'm consulting you right now, I replied evenly. The decision deadline isn't for another week. There's no decision, she said coldly. We're not moving. End of discussion. The old me would have immediately backed down, apologizing for even considering upsetting her carefully maintained world. But instead, I calmly sipped my water and met her stare. I haven't decided yet, I said, emphasizing each word carefully. And when I do, it'll be based on what's best for my future. Her face shifted swiftly, from anger to disbelief, and then something closer to panic. This wasn't just about a job offer, it was a direct challenge to her control, a declaration of independence she'd never expected. If you accept that position, don't expect me to come along, she threatened, playing what she thought was her strongest card with desperate confidence. My own response surprised even me. I understand, I told her quietly. That's your choice to make. The drive home was tense and silent, filled with the weight of unspoken implications. She had counted on her ultimatum ending any further discussion, but instead, it clarified exactly what was at stake. Later, while she slept, I sat quietly in my dimly lit office, reviewing finances, researching apartments in San Francisco, making lists of what I'd keep and what I leave behind. With each tangible step toward a new beginning, the heaviness in my chest lifted. It felt as if gravity itself was gradually loosening its grip on me. The next morning, my boss called unexpectedly, moving up the timeline. They needed my answer within 48 hours. I'll let you know tomorrow, I promised, a strange and steady calm washing over me. As I hung up, I noticed her standing in the doorway, expression unreadable. Who was that? She demanded suspiciously. My boss. They've moved up the decision deadline. She crossed her arms, eyes fixed on me. And what exactly are you going to tell them? I looked at the woman I'd built my life around pleasing, feeling the last threads of our dysfunctional connection finally snap. I'm going to tell them yes, I replied simply, my voice calm and certain. I'm accepting the position. The table was no longer wobbling. It was about to be flipped upside down entirely. Her reaction didn't come right away. Instead, she stared at me, processing what I'd said. Her expression shifted through disbelief, rage, and something unfamiliar fear. The ironclad control she thought she held was slipping rapidly through her fingers. "You're bluffing," she finally stated, forcing calmness into her tone. "You wouldn't destroy our marriage over some job." "I'm not destroying anything," I clarified firmly. "I'm taking a valuable career opportunity. Whether or not our marriage survives it, that's entirely up to you." She laughed harshly, a sharp, brittle sound. "Now suddenly I'm the unreasonable one, because I don't want to upend my entire life over your random impulse about California?" "No," I corrected gently. "You're unreasonable because you assumed I'd automatically refuse a life-changing opportunity without discussion. Because you think your comforts should automatically outweigh my dreams. Because you assume you hold veto power over my choices. That's exactly what marriage is," she exploded, her voice rising sharply. "Compromise. Consideration. Putting us first. Compromise goes both ways," I countered quietly. "When was the last time you compromised on anything meaningful? When did you prioritize my needs above your own convenience?" She flinched, as if I'd physically struck her. "I've sacrificed everything for us," she claimed indignantly. "Name one significant sacrifice you've made," I challenged. "One that wasn't really about keeping things exactly how you want them." Her silence spoke louder than any explanation could. She paced the living room, clearly recalculating her strategy. Finally, she softened her tone, adopting a conciliatory voice. "Let's both calm down," she proposed. "We're saying things we don't really mean. We can step back and discuss this rationally tomorrow." Her favorite tactic: delay, defuse, then redirect once emotions cooled. But I'd stopped playing her carefully scripted relationship games. "There's nothing else to discuss," I said firmly. "I've already decided. I'm moving to San Francisco next month. You're welcome to come with me, or not. That's your choice." "If you go through with this," she whispered dangerously, her voice barely audible, "there won't be any going back after this. You realize that, don't you?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand completely." "And you're still choosing some job over me? Over everything we've created?" The way she framed it, that this was simply choosing a job over her, perfectly illustrated the fundamental flaw in our relationship. To her, any decision I made that didn't prioritize her first was automatically a betrayal. "I'm choosing myself," I explained calmly, perhaps for the first time since we'd met. Something in her broke right then. She grabbed the nearest thing, a crystal vase we'd gotten as a wedding gift, and threw it violently against the wall, shattering it into pieces. "You selfish bastard," she screamed, her voice shrill. "After everything I've done for you?" I remained still, refusing to react to the chaos she was deliberately creating. This, too, was familiar, a manufactured crisis to distract from the real issues and to reframe herself as the victim. "I've managed every part of your life," she shouted, tears flowing now. "I've shaped you into someone better. Without me, you'd still be that weak, directionless boy I first met." In those few words, she'd inadvertently revealed more truth than years of careful manipulation ever had. She hadn't wanted a partner. She'd wanted a project, something she could mold and possess, proof of her own significance. "Thank you for being honest," I said quietly. "That actually clarifies things a lot." My composed reaction only fueled her anger. Storming into the dining room, she literally flipped our table, plates and glasses crashing onto the floor. "There," she yelled wildly. "Is this what you wanted? Tables flipped, everything ruined." I stared calmly at the overturned furniture, the shattered dishes, physical evidence of her crumbling control, and felt oddly peaceful. "Sometimes things need to break before they can be rebuilt properly," I said. I stepped past her into her bedroom and began packing a suitcase. She followed, alternating between angry threats, desperate pleas, heartfelt promises, and sharp accusations. I calmly continued packing, sorting the items I'd need immediately from things I could deal with later. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded sharply as I zipped my bag closed. "A hotel for tonight," I answered evenly. I'll make arrangements for the rest of my things soon. You walk out that door, and I'll change the locks, she threatened, blocking my pass. That would certainly simplify breaking the lease, I pointed out practically. But that's entirely your call. As I moved toward the exit, her final desperate act unfolded. Dropping suddenly to her knees, she began sobbing, clinging desperately to my clothes. Please, she begged, her voice cracking. I'll do whatever it takes. We can fix this. I'll go to therapy. I'll change, I promise. For a moment, old habits tugged at me, a lingering sense of responsibility for her feelings. But then, gently, I disentangled her hands. I sincerely hope you do get help, I told her. But don't do it for me, do it for yourself. I stepped through the door carrying nothing but my suitcase, feeling an indescribable, weightless freedom. The next 6 months passed quickly, filled with experiences I'd never imagined. San Francisco welcomed me with its foggy mornings and vibrant, bustling energy, so different from the suffocating familiarity I'd left behind. My new apartment, modest but with a breathtaking bay view, was the first place I'd truly considered my own in years. The divorce process turned out to be surprisingly straightforward once she realized her usual manipulations wouldn't bring me back. She kept most of our furniture. I kept my freedom. It felt like a fair trade. My new job challenged me in ways I'd nearly forgotten were possible. Ideas flowed freely now, without the internal censor constantly worrying whether they'd meet with approval at home. My colleagues quickly became friends who only knew the man I'd become, someone confident, engaged, and finally free of those invisible chains I'd dragged around for years. One warm evening, sitting out on my balcony watching the sunset color the sky in deep ambers and soft pinks, my phone vibrated. A message from my mother read simply, "Proud of you, son. You finally sound happy again." Happy. It was such a straightforward word for the deep change I'd undergone. It wasn't just happiness, it was authenticity. Control over my own life. The quiet strength of making choices without calculating the emotional price. The doorbell rang, breaking my reflective mood. A delivery had arrived, the final box of belongings she'd reluctantly agreed to send after initially threatening to destroy them. I set it in the corner unopened, not ready yet to confront those remnants of my old life. But curiosity eventually got the better of me. Later that night, I carefully cut through the packing tape and began sorting through the contents. Some books, winter clothing, my grandfather's watch. At the bottom, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was a framed photo of us on our wedding day. I studied our expressions closely, searching for signs of what would come. I noticed now that her smile was triumphant rather than joyful. Mine had a subtle uncertainty, as if some part of me sensed the bargain I was unknowingly making. Putting the photo aside, I reached for the last item, a handwritten letter. Despite reservations, I opened it. "I still can't understand why you'd throw everything away," it began abruptly. No greeting, no warmth, just accusations dressed as confusion. "We could have had a perfect life if you just appreciated what I was trying to build for us. Maybe someday you'll realize what you've lost and come back to your senses. Perhaps then I'll even forgive you." Carefully folding the letter, I slid it back into its envelope. Even now, she failed to see that what I discarded was nothing more than a carefully decorated cage, that her idea of perfection demanded my submission and diminishment. Her offer of forgiveness was simply another form of manipulation, bait to pull me back into orbit around her. A year earlier, those words would have deeply wounded me, sparking guilt and self-doubt she'd so skillfully cultivated. Now, they merely confirmed that walking away was the only choice left. Taking the wedding photo to the kitchen, I removed it from its frame, holding it over the sink. Briefly, I considered burning it, a dramatic act of final closure. But instead, I methodically tore it in half, then into quarters, and continued until it was nothing but tiny scraps, floating away like confetti down the drain. Some people might label my story a failure, a collapsed marriage, 5 years seemingly wasted on painful lessons. But standing in my simple kitchen, watching evidence of my past swirl down the drain, I saw it differently. It was a reclamation. That evening, I met some friends at a local restaurant for dinner. They knew fragments of my past but never saw me as defined by it. As we laughed together, discussing our upcoming hiking plans, I experienced a sudden moment of disorientation, like stepping onto firm land after months spent adrift at sea. "You all right?" asked the woman next to me, noticing I'd briefly drifted away. "Better than all right," I answered honestly, just realizing something important. The realization was both simple and profound. Genuine intimacy couldn't be treated as currency, something to offer or remove from a table as leverage. It wasn't a reward earned by obedience or a privilege to be withheld as punishment. True intimacy grew naturally from mutual respect and the freedom to be completely yourself without fear of rejection. My ex-wife had declared intimacy unavailable until I complied with her rules. In response, I hadn't simply overturned her table. I built a new one entirely. A solid, balanced space, welcoming to those who clearly knew the difference between genuine love and manipulative control. As I raised my glass in a toast to adventures still ahead, I silently thanked her for presenting me with an ultimatum that ultimately set me free.